So today we have with us Dr. Ryann Watson-Stites. She's a PhD and pediatric neuropsychologist. Ryann specializes in how problems with the brain relate to problems at school, at home, with peers, socially, that kind of thing. And she's going to talk to us today about assessment and eligibility of TBI. And I will let Ryann take it from here. And Ryann, please feel free to share anything else you want them to know about you.
Okay, thanks so much, Melissa. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for tuning in, especially for staying after school on Halloween. I know that everybody is anxious to get home for trick-or-treaters, so thank you very much for tuning in. And Melissa, certainly, if anybody needs clarification on anything or has a question that you feel is timely, feel free to interrupt me, and I'm happy to answer things as we go along. I am presenting today, as Melissa said, on assessment and TBI and special education eligibility. But always, as a pediatric neuropsychologist, we have to start. Sorry, Melissa, it's not progressing. There we go. The screen was frozen. As a pediatric neuropsychologist, we always have to start at what is neuropsychology, because that's always the first question. And Melissa talked about it a little bit, but what neuropsychology is it's the study of brain behavior relationships. And so as a neuropsychologist, I specialize in how cognitive function and behavior are affected by neurological conditions, including neurologic insults like concussions and other brain injuries, and neurologic diseases like epilepsy or a brain tumor. As a neuropsychologist, I used standardized norm-referenced measures to quantify thinking ability, and some of the measures that I use are the same as what you will see school psychologists use, and some are unique to neuropsychology. But regardless of what tests are used, neuropsychological assessment is really much more than specific tests. So as a neuropsychologist, I have specialized training in how to interpret these patterns of complex cognitive data and to understand how different thinking patterns tell us useful information about how the brain is functioning. So there's lots of different ways to take a look at how the brain is working. We can take a picture of the brain. We can take a look at functional imaging of the brain like fMRI. We can take a look at physiology, such as using EEG. But what does the brain do? The brain thinks. And so to do a real functional test of how the brain is functioning, how the brain is working, we do thinking tests, so neuropsychological testing. As a neuropsychologist, all neuropsychologists have PhDs in psychology or clinical psychology, and we have completed, the bare minimum is 2 full-time years of specialized training in neuropsychology. In addition to state licensure, many of us have board certification, and those are just the fancy extra initials after my name. And all this to say that if you're looking for a board certified neuropsychologist in your area, you can check the board website or take a look at psychologists in your area, their credentials, and look for the fancy initials after their name of ABPP. So let's start out, now that we know a little bit about neuropsychology and who I am as a neuropsychologist, let's start talking about eligibility and getting eligibility for special education on the basis of traumatic brain injury. So traumatic brain injury eligibility for special education, when we talk about that, they have a very specific definition of traumatic brain injury. It's this great big long paragraph. But just briefly, to read a little bit of this, traumatic brain injury means, per this definition, an acquired injury to the brain caused by an external force resulting in total or partial functional disability or psychosocial impairment. And a couple things that I want to point out about this definition is that it adversely affects a child's educational performance, of course, for IEP eligibility. And in addition to it talking about cognition, like including language and memory and attention and reasoning, it also talks about psychosocial behaviors. So it doesn't just need to be cognitive, can also have a behavioral or can be only limited to a behavioral or psychosocial impact but maybe not necessarily picked up on cognitive testing. And the other piece to note about how Oregon defines TBI eligibility is that the term does not include brain injuries that are congenital or degenerative, or brain injuries induced by birth trauma. So sometimes people will talk about kids with cerebral palsy, for example, having a TBI, but they do not fit this definition of TBI eligibility for special education because that's a perinatal injury. It happens in utero or around the birthing process, and so is not an external force that falls under this category of Oregon TBI. So traumatic brain, the category of TBI for eligibility for special education is different than categories that we commonly talk about, like specific learning disability, in that it's a difficulty, the educational impact is secondary to an acute event. So a kid is functioning at one level, has an acute medical event, and then is functioning at a different level. And so there is a change in their level of function. And that change in function isn't static. They don't have the medical event and then have this change in function that then just stays stable. It changes over time because the brain is recovering. And with the recovery process of the brain also comes the recovery process of skills. And so those skills are constantly a moving target and constantly changing. And the needs or interventions that these kids need are typically not limited to a single area. So it's not limited to reading, for example, or math or writing, but it tends to be more sort of general accommodations needed across settings, things like extended time or checks for comprehension, those more general. Eligibility requirements when you are using the eligibility category of TBI is that kids have to have a medical statement documenting that they had a traumatic brain injury. And then they also have to have a comprehensive psychological assessment. And it's specified that that assessment has to be given by an individual who has training and experience to administer and interpret the tests within the battery. So again, this sort of makes TBI different in that you need that medical statement and then the psychological assessment is required. When we're talking about traumatic brain injury, we're talking about a full range of kids because TBI ranges from mild to severe. And certainly it's true that most children with traumatic brain injuries do not require an IEP. So we're really talking about a subset of kids with traumatic brain injury when we're talking about eligibility for an IEP. The most common type of brain injury that you'll hear about is concussion, which is by definition a mild traumatic brain injury. And kids with concussion, most kids are able to recover from a concussion within a month, and so only need very short-term accommodations. And for the definition of TBI for an IEP, the effects from the brain injury must last over 60 days. So for a TBI eligibility for special education for an IEP, we're talking about the kids who have persistent effects where the effects last more than a couple months. And then there are kids who have these kind of persistent effects, so they last for a while, but that don't need curriculum modifications, so they only need accommodations and can be adequately served by a 504 plan, so you don't need to seek an IEP for lots of kids with traumatic brain injuries. But then, of course, there are those that do need traumatic brain injury services or eligibility. And so let's talk about for those kids who have persistent effects of a traumatic brain injury beyond that 60-day period, what should you look for in terms of effects of a traumatic brain injury, and how would you go about the assessment, thinking about assessment? For a psychological assessment of traumatic brain injury, let's first keep in our minds that the effects do not need to be cognitive or academic for an eligibility on the basis of traumatic brain injury. It can be related to psychosocial behavior. But I want to look further So we're keeping that in mind, but also we're going to delve deeper into cognitive effects of traumatic brain injury, and I'm really going to talk about those more at length today. So the cognitive effects of a traumatic brain injury can be highly variable, both due to, we talked about how TBI can range from mild to severe. So the severity of the injury certainly impacts how somebody's cognition is affected. Also, the location of the injury can impact how cognition is affected. Some people have very focal injuries to a very specific part of the brain, but most people have more diffuse injuries that affect multiple, the brain as a whole, multiple areas of the brain. And then the age of the person when they sustain their traumatic brain injury can also affect the cognitive results of the injury. Psychological assessment of a traumatic brain injury commonly include lots of different cognitive domains. So I think about intellectual ability, I think about attention and executive function. I think about how memory is impacted by traumatic brain injuries, how language is impacted, how visual spatial ability is impacted, psychomotor skills, and also academic abilities. School psychologists are used to giving IQ tests, and so I want to talk a little bit about how performance on a measure of intellectual ability can be impacted by a traumatic brain injury. IQ deficits are most common when the injury is severe. So we typically don't see impact on an IQ test in terms of an overall IQ score or what we consider intellectual reasoning abilities unless the person has more of a moderate to severe brain injury. And people who have more diffuse brain injuries rather than localized, and in kids that are younger, so especially before the age of 3, those kids can have more of a catastrophic IQ impact from a severe brain injury. When we look at patterns, how kids do on IQ tests and the patterns of impact on IQ profiles, we see that nonverbal and fluid reasoning tasks are more impacted by brain injury effects than verbal intellectual ability. And when considering IQ profiles in a child who has had a traumatic brain injury, processing speed indices or cognitive efficiency indices are the most susceptible to impact from a traumatic brain injury. School psychologists often also give memory measures. There's story, memory, tasks embedded within some of the test batteries that we give, like the Woodcock-Johnson. And verbal learning and verbal recall can be impacted by traumatic brain injury, and in general, just gaining new information and skills can be impacted by traumatic brain injury, but it's the verbal subtasks and verbal learning that can be especially sensitive to the changes of traumatic brain injury. School psychologists often give tests of academic skills. When a child has a traumatic brain injury, there's the most impact on skills learned after their injury, so they are slower to accrue academic skills after their injury. And then in terms of the types of academic measures that we give, we commonly see the most impact on fluency or speeded measures, timed measures, again going back to that underlying processing speed being a problem in children with traumatic brain injuries. So I talked a little bit about IQ and memory and academic skills because those are the skills that are most commonly assessed in the school setting. But it's really important when talking about traumatic brain injury to spend most of your time talking about attention and executive function because those are the cognitive domains that are most frequently impacted by traumatic brain injury, and it's the most frequent complaint among children with TBI. And that is due to brain reasons. 2 big reasons why attention and executive function are most impacted by TBI, neuroanatomy, and then also the pattern of brain development. So you can't have a neuropsychologist give you a talk without talking about neuroanatomy. So we're going to do a couple neuroanatomy slides here to take a look at the neuroanatomy of executive function. And it has this pretty picture here, has this yellow highlight because that's the lobe that we're talking about the most when we're talking about attention and executive function, is this frontal lobe. So this whole part is called the frontal lobe, but then it's the prefrontal area that is especially related to executive function. And it's that frontal lobe, it's that very front part of the brain that is most susceptible to brain injury. And that's because when the skull is jolted too fast or it's impacted by something, the brain shifts and hits against the skull. So we talk about coup and contra coup effects, where the brain shakes in the skull and it bangs up against these spiny protrusions on the front part of the skull, and so you get this bruising that happens in the front. And this is a slide showing MRI findings, abnormalities following brain injury in children, and you can see that it's most often in the frontal lobes, and then in the back also, where the skull is hitting in the back. So these frontal lobes that are so important to attention and executive function are the most commonly injured parts of the brain with traumatic brain injury. Also, in addition to the neuroanatomical reasons for executive function being most impacted by traumatic brain injury, another reason is the pattern of development. And everybody knows this. You all know this, even though you might not have thought about it before. We have very different expectations at different ages for kids' ability to pay attention and for their executive function. Your expectations for what a kindergartner can pay attention to and how long that kindergartner can pay attention is going to be much different than your expectations for a fifth grader, and your expectations for a fifth grader are going to be much different than your expectations for a 10th grader. And so we all already have in our, we already have in our brains these different expectations for different ages, and there's a good reason for that, and that is that the frontal lobes are the last to develop. How our brain matures is it matures from the back to the front. So the rate of cognitive development is most rapid until age 9, and then it's followed by deceleration. So everybody here listening to us, we're all getting worse over time. We are way past our peak. But the peak performance in many cognitive areas is reached in adolescence. So in 14 to 16-year-olds, they're already at adult levels of cognitive function. But that's not true for executive function. Executive function and some other skills continue to develop into the mid-20s. And so when a kid has a brain injury and they don't have a fully developed frontal lobe yet, they are more susceptible to the changes that you would see with frontal lobe injury, because it's not only the injury itself, but also the impact of the injury on development of the frontal lobe going forward. All right, so I've brought up this term executive function a whole lot, and I'm sure all of you have heard the term executive function before, but I want to get really concrete about what executive function is and what that looks like in the classroom, so that all of you have your ears perked about executive function and can think about kids who maybe need to be assessed for traumatic brain injury. So the bottom line, what is executive function? Executive function is cognitive control. So what this looks like to teachers and to parents and occupational therapists and speech therapists, people who are working with these kids on a daily basis, is that kids who have problems with executive function require more repetition of instructions. They're easily disrupted by noise. So teachers will say that they have a really hard time working in a busy classroom, or parents will talk about them having difficulty being able to do their homework at the kitchen table. It takes longer for these kids to finish tasks, again, going back to that slower processing speed. Kids can have a slower response time because it takes longer, again, for them to process information. These kids can get easily overloaded by information, and a common complaint is that they can't do multiple step directions. You need to give them one instruction or or 2 instructions at a time. Otherwise, they get disorganized. Commonly, kids are having problems with forgetting homework, forgetting materials, forgetting their jackets, losing their belongings. They're having problems being consistent in their learning. So it seems like they know one thing one day, but then seem to have forgotten it the next day. So they're described as really inconsistent learners. 3 core executive functions are inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And we'll talk about each of these and give you some concrete examples about how it impacts academics. So inhibitory control is being able to control your impulses. It's being able to stay focused even when there are distractions in your environment. It's being able to stay on task and actually complete the task rather than get distracted. And it's being able to inhibit acting on your impulses and instead making a more considered response. Working memory is being able to hold information in mind and manipulate it, being able to work with it in your mind. So working memory is really critical for making sense of anything that unfolds over time, because you have to remember what just happened and project yourself forward to what is going to happen, and so to be able to follow that sequence and relate multiple steps to each other. So working memory is crucial for relating one idea to another. For example, when reading, being able to relate what you read earlier to what you're reading now. When you're doing math, being able to do mental math calculations. Being able to understand cause and effect relationships, and so for consequences to work, you have to have a good working memory intact. And remembering multiple step directions and executing them in the correct order. These are all things that are reliant on working memory. Cognitive flexibility is different. Cognitive flexibility is being able to easily and quickly switch perspectives or the focus of attention to be able to cognitively shift in between ideas or activities. It's being able to change your behavior depending on what the current demands are or what the current priorities are. It's be able to think outside the box and be able to do things differently at different times. My fun little slide for cognitive flexibility. These kids get stuck in one place or another. Higher order executive functionings include problem solving, reasoning, planning, organization, and people will put self-regulation skills under this category too. So things like self-monitoring and emotional regulation. So when you start talking about specific executive functions, you can see that it encompasses a whole lot and can affect a whole lot. And in fact, it starts feeling like this, and that's true. If you have problems with executive function, it ends up cascading into problems in lots of different areas. So let's start talking about the academic impact of problems with attention and executive function. So deficits in executive function can impede school performance well beyond missing assignments and losing materials. Let's look at some concrete examples of how different types or different aspects of executive function can impact different types of academic skills. So for reading, students who have problems with working memory have problems being able to remember key points that they read or picked up earlier. They have problems with comprehension because they can't keep information in mind through the whole passage. Kids with cognitive flexibility, these are the kids that really interpret language literally. So they have problems with inferencing and inferring. They have problems being able to read between the lines, so their comprehension is especially impacted. Kids who have inhibitory control problems, when they're reading and you're listening to them read, they guess at words a lot rather than taking the time to sound them out. They commonly are trying to answer comprehension questions without thoroughly reading the passage, and so they're just sort of rushing through things, being impulsive. For writing or cognitive flexibility, kids who have problems with cognitive flexibility, they get frozen. When I ask them what's hard about writing, cognitive flexibility kids say that what's hard about writing is coming up with something to write, that they really struggle. They have writer's block. They really struggle with what to write about, and their solution is sometimes they're writing the same subject over and over in the same format for each writing requirement, or they just don't write much at all because they're just sort of stuck. My kids who have problems with organization, they have, it's a real struggle for them to make an outline or come up with a plan for what they're going to write. When they do come up with a plan, it's not organized. So they present facts and ideas in a very disorganized, illogical order and include a lot of non-essential details, but that can be true for our impulsive kids too, our inhibitory control kids. They can write too much, commonly including things that are of minor importance to the story, so lots of inessential details rather than essential details, and they're just sort of rushing through. Kids who have problems with attention and executive function commonly have problems with math, and in fact, math is the most susceptible academic skill to medical problems in general, and in general to any loss of instruction time. And so if a kid is out for a week because they had a concussion, or if a kid is out for a week or a month because of other big medical reasons, math is the academic skill that is the most fragile in that context because it's so hierarchical in nature. And when you miss math instruction and then try to enter it later on in the lesson period, then you don't have those lower level skills needed to build upon. And so it can cascade and snowball into a big math problem when kids are losing instruction time. And by losing instruction time, it's not just not being in the classroom, but also being in the classroom but not paying attention. And so, again, kids with attention and executive function can especially have some problems with math. Inhibitory control kids, they're your careless kids. They're making all kinds of careless mistakes. They're not watching the operation signs on a calculation worksheet, so they're subtracting when they should be adding. They're skipping steps. They don't thoroughly read the instructions or listen to the instructions, so they're rushing through. Cognitive flexibility kids with math have real problems being able to recognize when something is presented in a different format. So these are the kids that struggle with understanding that 3 plus 5 is the same as 5 plus 3. Whenever you present something in a different format, it's a real struggle for them to recognize that it's the same operation. Working memory kids have problems with being able to track through math problems because they're, again, having difficulties holding information in mind. And so they can have problems with the sequencing and can frequently have a wrong answer simply because they missed a step somewhere in there. Math classes are the classes that most commonly have daily assignments that are due. And so when you have a kid who has organization problems, they are going to have problems with missing assignments and keeping track of assignments and keeping track of when tests are happening, etc. And so if you have a kid who has organizational skill problems, they can especially struggle in math as well. So you can see how attention and executive function can have a real impact on math performance. Kids who struggle with attention and executive function have problems taking tests. Inhibitory control helps kids with not rushing through things and taking their time and checking their answers. So when kids have problems with inhibitory control, they're easily distracted. They don't develop an appropriate plan of attack by skimming the test and instructions before taking the test. They just sort of barrel through, and that can cost them testing efficiency. Cognitive flexibility, again, going back to these kids having a real problem with being able to recognize operations when presented in a different way. Lots of times teachers are challenging a child's understanding and mastery of a concept by presenting information on a test in a different format outside of how they have studied it previously. And so kids who have cognitive flexibility problems can have real difficulties being able to recognize what operations are needed and be flexible in their administration of different formulas, etc. Working memory, when kids who have working memory challenges are taking tests, they have trouble remembering information previously learned, and so they can struggle to hold on to and mentally manipulate related facts and concepts to answer the test questions. And kids who have problems with planning and organization can have a real problem taking tests too, because they spend too much time on some questions but yet rush through on others. They don't efficiently budget their time, and so they can struggle really showing what they know on tests. So that's sort of an overview of what you can see with problems with attention executive function in the classroom and in different areas of academic functioning. And so now I want to talk more about how we assess for executive dysfunction using tests. So anytime we talk about cognitive testing, we need to first talk about how cognitive testing, there's no such thing as a clean test of a specific function. So every time I'm giving a memory test, or every time I'm giving a processing speed test, or I'm giving a reading test, there's actually lots of different cognitive domains that are being tested. There's lots of different areas of cognition that go into how a child performs on any given task at any given time. So all behavior is multiply determined, and anytime we're testing cognition, what we're really doing is observing behavior. So again, there's no such thing as a clean test of a specific function. Formal assessment of executive function is less complex than the real world. So we talk a lot about ecological validity of executive function tests and the limitations of testing executive function in a clinical setting or a school setting. Anytime a psychologist pulls a kid out and tests them one-on-one, it's different than what happens in the real world, in their house, on the playground, in the classroom, where things are much more complex and there's no such thing as a distraction-free environment. So the one-on-one quiet clinical setting is much different than the chaos and messiness of everyday life. Also, when a psychologist has pulled a kid out and is working with them one-on-one and guiding them through cognitive tests, they're giving instructions, they're cueing the kid when to begin, they're helping monitor and pace tasks. And so we're really being the frontal lobes in a lot of different ways when we are testing a child in a clinical or school setting, and it just doesn't give them the same types of challenges that everyday life does. And so it's always really important when testing executive function or any kind of cognition, honestly, in this kind of setting, that the absence of impairment on clinical tests does not necessarily mean that there is an absence of impairment. So just because a kid performs well on a test doesn't mean that they would perform well out in the everyday environment. We don't just interpret our test results, we also take a good history about presenting concerns and how that child has developed over time. We observe the kid's behavior in our testing room and outside the testing room, and then we do formal testing as well. And it's always very important when doing an assessment to gain parent and teacher report. Psychologists use 4 types of procedures to assess for executive function when they are doing testing. We do the individual tests, so we have tests for executive function, but we also do a lot of observation of how a child approaches a task, how a child works through the testing protocol that we have. So those are called sort of process observations. One type of process observation is studying the pattern of errors or the types of errors that a student makes, and I'll walk you through an example of that. Another way that we take a look at how executive function is impacting test results is we really take a look at comparing how a student does on different types of tests. And so we do intra-individual comparison, taking a look at a testing profile or testing pattern. And parent-teacher rating scales are another way that we take a look at executive function. So let's walk through an example of how we would take a look at process observations through types of errors. So the Ray complex figure test is a task where we give them this big complex visual picture, and we ask the kid to copy it, and then we ask the kid to recall it a few minutes later from memory. And they have to draw the figure again from memory. And so this example is what James, who is age 10, recalled after 3 minutes of, again, this particular visual image. So he was given that complex figure. He copied it. They did something else for a little bit. They came back and asked him to recall it from memory and to draw it again. And this is what he drew. And so the question is this a memory problem, or is this another cognitive? Is this a problem with a different cognitive domain, and it might not be memory specific? So one of the reasons why a child might have this kind of a performance on a memory recall is that they have writing problems, or they have what we would call visual motor integration problems. So, they can see the figure, but they can't interpret that figure into what they draw themselves. So they just can't copy drawings well. So maybe that's what's going on with James. So to rule that out, you can give James other things to copy, simpler things to copy. So when you have James copy these tasks or these drawings, he does just fine. These are pretty good. And so it's not that he's having visual problems. It's not that he's having writing problems. It's not that he's having visual spatial integration problems. He's able to see something and then write it down. So that's not it. So maybe it is memory problem. So then we take a look at how he was able to copy that complex figure. So again, what he was presented with is on the left, and what he drew when it's sitting right in front of him is on the right. We know that he can copy things just fine. But the problem that he ran into here is that he is really disorganized in his drawing. He's really disorganized in his approach. He either rushed along and rushed right into the task so that he didn't take his time to come up with a planning and strategy, or he also just didn't take the time to notice the overall gestalt and to organize it into that, there's one big rectangle here that is split into quadrants. Each of these quadrants have these different designs in them. There's a triangle on the front, there's a triangle on the top, and there's this set of drawings on the bottom. So see, when I kind of talk through it and I organize it for myself, it's going to be much easier to remember if you remember it as a rectangle with different quadrants with designs in it, than if you are just trying to draw it and then remember it as this complex figure, which is what he did. And so if he drew it like this, it's no wonder that he wasn't able to recall all that much of it a little bit later. So that's just an example of talking through the different types of errors that kids can make and how problems with organization and executive function can show up even on tests that aren't an executive function test per se, but rather are a test of memory or other things. Their approach can really be affected by their problems with attention and executive function. Lots of other tests that we use. We use lots of specific tests for executive function. Some of them are embedded on other batteries. So digit span and picture span and letter number sequencing, those working memory tests that show up on IQ batteries are tests that I commonly use for assessment of executive function. Tests of memory, like what I was talking about in terms of story memory recall on Woodcock-Johnson tests, are another way that you can take a look at traumatic brain injury impact and organization and story recall. and analyzing those errors. There are some tests that really only neuropsychologists end up giving with for assessing for executive function, things like the Wisconsin card sorting task, the Stroop test, the trail making test. There's lots of different tower making tests out there. Um, there are batteries of executive function, like the Decaf-Kaplan test of executive function, or what we call the DCEFs, which include all kinds of different executive function tasks. We give a lot of continuous performance tests, so taking a look at how a kid can sustain attention over time. Examples of these include the CPT and the TOVA. Perhaps the best way to assess, because again, we have this discrepancy. Oh, sorry, this slide is sort of foggy. We have this discrepancy between what a kid can do in a clinical setting or a school setting where it's one-on-one with a psychologist. They can overperform because of all the structure that we provide. Sometimes the most sensitive measures to executive dysfunction and attention problems are parent and teacher behavior rating scales. And so the brief is the most commonly administered one for executive function. There's also different subscales that are embedded on the BASC and on CBCL measures. So, but getting the teacher to fill some out and getting parents to fill behavior measures out, you can see more impact because, again, they are observing kids in the classroom and at home in messy everyday environments rather than the quiet clinical setting of testing. So that is a quick overview. I wanted to reserve lots of time for questions. We certainly will post my slides so that you can access them, but you also can certainly email me with any questions too.
Okay. So we have two. One of them has quite a few questions within it, I think. So are you able to see it, Ryan, in the chat?
Let's see.
So it's from Jeannie Smith. And
I don't see it.
Okay, so I'll read it to you. It's
okay.
Assuming that there is medical statement documenting a TBI and information indicating that development was on track prior to TBI, what is needed to be given as a comprehensive psychological assessment for the eligibility statement in early childhood education? That's the first part. So if you want to answer that, I'll ask you the rest of them.
Okay, so I am not an early childhood education expert, and so it's a really good question for somebody who specializes in kids who are under school age. I see kids who are above, who are in school. So I assess kids age 3 to 18, but mostly it's kids age 6 and up. And it's a really good question as to what should go into a comprehensive psychological evaluation for these younger kids, because there isn't a whole lot out there. And while there are lots of research instruments that have been developed to take a look at executive function in toddlers and preschoolers, we don't have norm reference standardized clinically available measures for executive function in little kids. Commonly what we're doing with little kids is we're taking a look at their overall level of function, using something like the Bailey or the Mullen, where it breaks it down into cognitive skills and language skills and motor skills, and assessing how those are now versus how they were estimated to be prior to injury. But again, that's a really good question for an early childhood expert.
And your answer feeds right into the rest of what she wrote. So here, I'll read that to you. For example, if the child has delays and documented with the developmental assessment, e.g. Bailey, do we also need to administer the WPSI, for example, or is it appropriate to list the Bailey on the eligibility statement under comprehensive cognitive measure? I think you answered.
Yes, that's such a good question. We don't usually think of Bailey as let's put it this way. We usually think of Bailey as a developmental measure and WPSI as more of a specific cognitive measure. But I think it really matters as to what the standard is within your school district as to whether people will accept the Bailey or whether they need something more. Of course, the WIPSI, when you're giving a little kid WIPSI, like the 2.5 to 3.5-year-old version, um, it's a different animal than the bigger kid WIPSI. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I think it's mainly what the standard protocol is as to what's accepted Bailey versus something else
Yeah,
for
maybe
early childhood eligibility.
we
But
can.
I don't see a lot of WIPSIs given for that eligibility assessment, so I'm not sure. But I also, again, I'm seeing kids later, so I'm looking at history of. I also am not familiar with a lot of kids getting eligibility on the basis of TBI in early childhood for early childhood intervention. I see mainly developmental delays
Right.
so.
And
Good question.
that's something we've been talking a lot about, because once they get in that early ed, they get that developmental delay.
Right.
A lot of times
Yep.
we lose the TBI. So
Right.
all this is great questions, because we've been trying to figure out how to make sure the early ed folks get the kids into the right
Yeah.
category. So when they become school,
Right.
you know what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So maybe Ryan, we can get together and get a really solid answer to this question that we can share with some of our early childhood folks.
That sounds good.
I bet between us we can find someone who's really on top of the EI kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are neuropsychologists out there that specialize in, it's just another subspecialty area. So there are neuropsychologists out there that specialize in the littles. And
Yeah.
so we just need to talk with one of them.
Yeah, and I think it was Jeannie Smith who wrote that question. Jeannie, can you maybe cut and paste that into an email for me and send it to my email, and that way we can use that exact text as we find the more detailed answer for that for you. Okay, so we have another one. It says, do we see the same executive function concerns with a student who is regressing and has epilepsy, and can we use the same instructional strategies? These are students who may continue to develop acquire brain injury versus recovery in the case of TBI.
Absolutely. The quick answer to that.
Okay. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Students who have epilepsy are more at risk for, again, going back to how the brain develops and the pattern of brain development over time, that students who have epilepsy, especially with early onset, so from a younger age, can have disruption to brain development, so disruption to development of attention and executive function. More so than other kids. And so kids with epilepsy are at higher risk for problems with attention and executive function than kids without epilepsy. And what I talked about with executive function is true just for kids with executive function problems. It's not specific to TBI. It's just that TBI kids are at high risk for problems with attention and executive function. So that's why I spent so much time talking about it. But yes, go forward and apply it to all of your kids that have executive function problems, including kids with epilepsy.
Okay. And that is the last question that anybody typed in. We have Ryan for about 10 more minutes if anybody has anything else. Amanda, do you have a question? No, I don't. So we will have Ryan with us again on November 18th for our new member training. And I think the link's on the website, yes? Yeah. So under the TBI team piece of the website, you can register for that if you'd like. And then we also have Susan Davies on November 16th, November 16th, doing the next webinar. So feel free to sign up for that and share it with everybody. It's not limited to anyone, so we can have up to 100 people on. So feel free to share. Okay, last call for questions. Thank you for the
Last
compliment.
call for last call for now. You can certainly email me too if you have any specific questions.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, with that, happy Halloween, everybody. Ryann, thank you so much.
Happy
Everyone
Halloween.
always loves what you have to share.
Thanks so much for having me. I always love being here.
All right. See you soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.